Well, it's a pleasure to be here. Before we start, there's going to be some things I'm going to mention here. So I want to give you a reference in regards to areas of the country when you hear these terms. So for the Eastern Corn Belt, we're going to basically looking at, when I talk about Eastern Corn Belt, I'm going to talk about Indiana eastward. Central Corn Belt between Iowa, Illinois, Wisconsin, Minnesota. Western Corn Belt is the Dakotas, Nebraska, points to the south. Then what was the other one? We'll forget, we'll remember it when we get down the road. On the spot again, and if anybody, was anybody at the Juanita here 2 weeks ago? Good, I don't have to worry about me holding me to my forecast. But one of the things I've been arguing, kind of contradictory to what a lot I've been hearing on the internet and a lot of the ag blogs, is I'm not advocating that we're going to see a very rough pattern developing. And I made this same spiel last year, and we had a very strong La Nina event, and I was fairly comfortable that we were going to see some pretty significant weather, cold weather across the northern plains. And Mother Nature has a way of punishing climatologists when they open their big mouths and speaking. The reality is that as a climatologist, I look at statistical analysis and look at statistics as a way to kind of give you an idea where things should go. Unfortunately, when the statistics don't go your way, things can turn out rather ugly. And last year was an example, and a lesson learned. I always give that alternative to what the average forecast should be going forward. Typically, in a La Nina event, we're going to see more activity across the northern plains. So the Dakotas basically last year lost out on the snow. And that extended all the way into north central and northeastern Nebraska. And of course, we followed up with a very dry spring. Now, we should have seen a very strong jet stream, and the RDA that came in February that were lasting about 10 days, essentially was holding up to eliminate all of the warming we've seen the entire winter. When we look back at past patterns of La Ninas, and particularly in the strong and what we call the top half of the what we call moderate events, so the strongest of the moderate events. One night every 4 of those, we get a split flow pattern that drives energy through Texas and up through the Eastern Corn Belt, bypasses the northern plains. Well, that's not a big issue as long as the precipitation returns during the spring period, and they didn't do that, so we already had the exceptionally dry northern plains. And those that have heard me speak before, particularly in eastern Nebraska, I've always maintained that the key metric that we're looking for in the dryland environment in Nebraska is corn production. From October to the end of April was 12 inches of moisture. It's at that point that we've statistically matched what we would expect for infiltration into our soils. We didn't get that in northeast Nebraska. I think we only had about 8 inches on average in that area. So right away, we were sitting there 2/3 of what we should have gotten. And the farther north we went, the worse it is. It ain't happening this year, folks. And if you look at the last few months as an example of what's facing us going forward, I would be a little bit concerned. And the reason I say this is that let's go all the way back to October. We've seen the first atmospheric river events develop in the western United States. 2 of those hit Washington, southwestern British Columbia. 2 of those 2, one of them fell far south of the northern third of California. Those followed by 2 more atmospheric river events that hit southeastern Alaska and northern British Columbia. And then we see, as we got into December, a series of those storms hitting California. Now, downstream, we didn't get nearly the precipitation we would expect from an active cropping pattern in the western United States. But remember, we were coming out of the drought with very dry conditions across the northern plains and the development of dry conditions across the southern plains. So we didn't have the moisture at the surface, and secondarily, because we were coming out of this drought period, we had very warm temperatures in the wall. So even though we had the activity that we've seen materialize, once it got into the central plains, we just didn't get enough moisture evacuation in front of those storms to where they would really generate a lot of precipitation. Most of it generated to the south and to the east of us. Now, at the same time as we got into December, we had a large atmospheric trough develop over the Great Lakes region and the Hudson Bay region, and that area has been consistently cold for almost 4 consecutive weeks now. And when I, as a climatologist, learned in my training that the mean average time that we're sitting in a troughing pattern over the Hudson Bay is 6 weeks. It can vary from 4 to 8 weeks. There's a transition period once that trough deteriorates where it goes, emerges moving toward a westward position. So we get a trough over the western United States and a ridge over the eastern United States. And we're starting to see that transition now. If you remember the last few storms that went up the eastern seaboard, with very strong storm systems, this storm that's coming out this week, basically over the next 24 to 48 hours, is coming out of the south central Rockies in a normal path. It's just being pushed a little bit farther south because of the cold air that's going to arrive in time. But we generally see this during the transition period. So I'm either going to look like a hero or a fool here over the next few minutes as I go through these slides. But just as a climatologist, my expectation is that we will see some improving conditions. Hopefully there'll be enough that will undo some of the damage we've seen. So here is a picture of the drought monitor, really at its peak across the western United States. It doesn't take a genius to figure out that it's a substantial area of the western, 1/3 of the United States and the northern plains, running anywhere from moderate drought conditions to extreme drought conditions. A lot has changed in the last few months, and one of them has been a serious reduction in terms of drought over the western United States. At the same token, an increasing drought signature intensification over the south central plain. So this storm system that we're seeing, even though it's missing us and want that moisture, is highly important in terms as we go into the spring. The reason I say that is a substantial area of eastern Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas, just from this storm system alone, are expected anywhere from 1 to 4 inches of moisture with it. And then that will intensify as we move toward the northeast. We need that low level of moisture, first of all, as storms come out in the spring, to juice up the atmosphere. We already got the cold air law, so the unstable conditions are there. You need the low level moisture to really make these systems crank out. The more of these systems that do this, the better the odds are we're going to see weather conditions as we go into the spring. So when we look at the current drought monitor, when we look at the current drought monitor, the impacts of those storms on the western United States, although I see they increase the drought again in California, which is just mind-boggling, considering that Lake Tahoe, during the month of December, by the time we got to the end of December, had enough snowfall on the ground that they don't need another drop of snowfall for the remainder of the winter, and they'll still remain at normal snowfall. At the end of December, they were at the second highest snowfall total on record, eclipsing 2018, 2019, the last time we've seen this type of widespread snowfall in the western United States. But as I go back to 2019, look what happened downstream with the big snow that we had now in the Sierras, the Cascades, with the entire spine of the Rockies. That entire area was above normal snowpack. Subsequently, we had that much snow on the ground and evaporates, you get a cold pocket of wall. These systems coming from the west, we're going to cap that cold air, create the unstable conditions necessary for thunderstorm development. So as long as this trend continues, we should be in good shape. The question is, will it continue? And there are some signs that yes, it will. And one of the things that I I apologize here. One of the things that I watched is that when we see this atmospheric river events developing in the western United States, we had already underwent a very significant ice accumulation in the western Arctic. That's polar opposite we've seen in the last 2 years. Such that when storms came into the western United States, even though the cold air was a law here in the United States, it was definitely a law in the Gulf of Alaska. And that's what really got these storms up, got stronger and stronger. And there was a couple other things we'll show you here later. But look at the absence of ice in the Hudson Bay region, and all the way out to the channel of just basically between Newfoundland and Greenland. That area there didn't really start to freeze up until we got into the late December period. And it actually took a while longer for it to reach the Great Lakes region. To give you an idea, I hope this works. You can see now that we essentially have a above normal ice pack to the west and fairly close to normal now across the eastern Arctic Basin. Hudson Bay region is all filled in. And we are now 4 weeks, as I said, into this upper atmospheric trough. And we're starting to see some of those changes that are ongoing. So bear with me here. I can be a terrible forecaster just like every other climatologist and meteorologist, but I don't think it could be this bad of a forecaster. When I was home in December visiting my mom, right after Christmas, the Great Lakes, when I left, I got delayed a couple of days because of the snowstorm that went through here, also hit southern Michigan. It had less than 2% ice coverage in the Great Lakes. And between Christmas and New Year's, the director of the Great Lakes Ice Lab put their forecast out indicating maximum coverage on the Great Lakes of just under 13%, 12.5%. All right, keep that in mind. %39%. The irony was, as a meteorologist looking at the upper air chart, because they do my TRV forecasting for them, at that time when they put that forecast out, there was nothing in the models that would indicate that we were going to see anything but an upper air trough over the Great Lakes. And I told my mom at that time, I said, you're going to be fortunate if you see freezing during the month of January. They hit it today. The entire month of January without any freezing temperatures, or below freezing temperatures. So we're an average increase now over the last 4 weeks of about 1.3% a day ice coverage over the Great Lakes increase. With 2 more weeks to go before they hit their seasonal average peak, middle of February, and typically that is run between 50 and 55% ice coverage. Last week, the director came out and said, we're going to revise our forecast. We're going to 48% coverage across the entire Great Lakes. Now, I wish I could do that type of thing and I'd get laughed off the stage, but that's the reality of the situation. We still do not expect it to get to normal. I will tell you that in the last week, this went from 23% coverage to 39% coverage because Lake Erie is now frozen over. And one of the things that I learned in the Great Lakes is if you start the season out with no ice, it's coming most likely at the end of the season. You start out with ice at the beginning of the season, high the accumulation, the snow belt shuts off, the ice freezes, and then you end up basically having a very benign second half of the winter. Hail of 2 seasons in the upper Great Lakes. The bigger issue on this, and this is very, very important, is that this ice continues in the process as it is for the next 2 weeks. I think we're going to be somewhere between 55 to 60% ice coverage. And the bigger issue is as we go into the spring, those cool ice conditions are going to keep that area colder than normal until the ice off the Great Lakes disappears. So all those areas, the eastern Corn Belt, particularly Indiana, Ohio, are going to have in a northwest flow cold air coming across the Great Lakes. So right away, I would be inclined to say that as we go into spring, you're probably going to see cooler than normal conditions, coupled with the tendency for La Nina conditions to bring above normal moisture to the eastern Corn Belt, of which we have seen so far, and it started late last summer. I would argue that this area is prime and probably has the highest flood risk of any area of the country going into spring planting season. If you want to consider Kentucky and Tennessee part of that region, because it is in the Ohio River Valley, that's where the bigger issue lies. The second area that I would pay attention to closely is the Red River Valley of eastern North Dakota and western Minnesota. Extensive precipitation in this area starting in late August, and we build up some substantial moisture in those regions. And so if we get a normal semblance of the regular pattern you would expect during the spring, with their snows or with their flooding that we do in the Red River Valley, but more importantly, have enough moisture in the profile right now to reduce its average when we crop. That's the eastern half of the south of North Dakota, not the western half of eastern Montana. But at least in that region, we're going to see much more favorable conditions going into the spring. So 1 year ago, this is important, you can kind of start to see these changes. 1 year ago, the heaviest of the snowfall, which is the remainder of what happened with our big snow event in Lincoln. You've seen that basically cutting across the central Corn Belt. And look at the axis of snow up in the east in the Eastern Dakotas. It's essentially the Red River Valley. You don't have a lot of depth. Most of it up into the northeast, and not a lot of good signature across the Rocky Mountains and the Sierras and the Cascades. Let's look at it this year. Much more intense depth at the surface. But that's important also because the longer that snow stays there, supported with maintaining cold air at the surface. So we have a transition zone between the ridge to the west, the upper air trough over the Hudson Bay region. And almost to a T, that mean position of that trough is just basically about 60, 70 miles west of where that trough is cutting that snowpack from north central south from North Dakota all the way down into southern Iowa. That already there's that 4 weeks. You should start to see a transition, but more importantly, the widespread snow up the Rocky Mountains, particularly central and northern Rockies, and within the Great Basin region, something we didn't see last year. So once again, this is really very close to what we would expect in terms of a normal La Nina pattern. Now, I'm going to go through this real briefly because as we've already talked about, one of the things I'm going to point out, and this was the Southeast Wyoming snowpack, this come out the 9th of January. Essentially what they were indicating, if you could go a whole month without any snowfall, it would still be a normal snowpack within the mountains. So, one of the things that I remember the previous speaker when I just walked in was talking about was these big jumps. And that's not uncommon. In the western United States, you're going to hear this atmospheric river. They've already run across a couple more times, a couple times this fall. We'll probably see a return to it because it causes flooding problems. And of course, it seems like doom and gloom sells in the news. The reality of the situation is this is nothing unusual. This is expected. In fact, NOAA's done extensive studies on this. 50% of the snowfall accumulates Rocky Mountains westward is a direct result of atmospheric river events. The difference between a below normal year and an above normal year in terms of snowpack is a number of those events. We've already had at least 3 of them that have occurred. And depending on who you talk to, you can almost go 4. 2018, 2019 winter, there was 5 of these atmospheric river events that produced an average snowpack in the Sierras of 180% of normal snowpack. Lake Tahoe had received enough snowfall by the end of December, as that last system kicked out and brought the blizzard conditions to portions of the northern plains and the I-80 corridor. Their snowpack was sufficient enough that they could go the entire winter without any snowfall still being normal. They were already well ahead of the 2018-2019 period and had tied the second snowiest winter to start. Now, they haven't had much precipitation since, so everybody's starting to get freaked out once again. But this would argue that when they do get their precipitation, they come in surges. The big thing will be, does this trough shift from the Great Lakes position, Hudson Bay, to a position where we'll start to see some of that energy coming in the western United States? And if that transition is going to occur, it should occur over these next 4-week period. As I said, there are some signs that are showing up, but not to the point where we see aggressive storming that's yet developed in the western United States. So, why am I arguing this is different this year? We're going to go through these real quick. Don't have to worry about the intensity of them. It's just the pattern. Where is it cool? Where is it warm? So from temperatures of fall 2020, you notice that the vast majority of the cold air that did circulate into the North America and into the continental United States is directed to just to the east of the excuse me, apologize, directed south and east of the Rocky Mountains. Both coasts were warmer than normal. Yet here this year, the same period, you see the warmest temperatures in the center part of the country who were on the coast. So that's a 180-degree flip from the 2 fall seasons. Let's look at the precipitation. Fall precipitation, fairly dry across the Dakotas, most of it in the southeastern United States, and just a smattering of it up in the Pacific Northwest over the Rockies. Very dry conditions in California. Those areas that were exceptionally dry turning exceptionally wet. Those areas that were exceptionally wet turning exceptionally dry compared to the 2 fall periods. So there's definitely a 180-degree shift in the patterns during the fall period. And the reason that I bring up the storm system once again is look at the dry pattern established in eastern Texas and southeastern Oklahoma. We need this moisture to wet those surfaces up. So it's available for advection, and we're going to be getting into warm season. So even with the absence of snowfall and precipitation in the western United States for the better part of this last month, you're still maintaining a very strong wet signal. The one thing I want to draw your attention to is that I've heard the ag blogs talking, and a lot of our colleagues that don't really know what a drought is, I'm afraid to say, in the Eastern Corn Belt and the Central Corn Belt, complaining about the recent dryness and their concerns. And I've seen a bunch of them coming out of Wisconsin talking about how dry it was. My goodness, folks, if you forget about the precipitation that fell the second half of August, more than enough to meet what remainder of the crop demands and get surplus moisture. So any area that was showing exceptionally dry during the fall period across Wisconsin had anywhere from 6 to 12 inches of moisture. I don't know about you, but I know for a fact that moisture didn't go anywhere. It's in that profile outside of what was being used. So conditions are much better in Wisconsin than we expected. Yeah, they don't look so great here in the Ohio River Valley from August or in Nebraska. But what is important is the total precipitation that has fallen. Once again, take this value times 0.7, you're going to get within 1 inch of what that soil moisture profile does. And we have published research on this. I'm not going to go into rather talk about this in the past. So, from an argument standpoint, who knows what's going to happen with supply issues, COVID, all the rest of it. All I can tell you is what the weather conditions are and what the impacts of those would be, at least for one portion of the equation, that is soil moisture that is available for growth during the cropping season. Pretty much all these areas in green have that minimum of 6 inches of moisture in the profile. We look at a 5-foot profile holding 10 inches available moisture in that 5-foot profile, which is 2 inches per variable foot, which is very common in a non-no-till environment. Then we essentially didn't take much this spring for these same areas to turn into a soupy mess. The biggest issue will be, does the precipitation itself get cut off if we get into the growing season? And from that aspect, I would suspect that it would be a long, slow process. Why be more concerned with the issue of excessive moisture continuing on for the first month of the growing season before it shuts down? Basically, Central Eastern Corn Belt, they're more prone to those type of drought type scenarios than they are for here in the Western Corn Belt, where we can see this thing coming like a steam locomotive 6 months before it happens, simply because of the drying conditions. So this area you see in block here, it's over 90% of the dryland corn production region of the United States. All those little periphery areas outside of here, and then I don't mean to make light of western Nebraska, dryland production on the corner, are meaningless in the scale of the national corn. Because our irrigated yields consistently come in right within what the expectations of the market. And so it's basically, they're saying we guarantee it, but from a market standpoint, it's almost a given that we're going to produce 1 million plus bushel of corn in Nebraska through irrigation. Where the real issue lies is the dryland regions, particularly cattle grazing and the wheat crop. And you can see a lot of areas on the front side of the Rocky Mountains from Colorado southward haven't received a little over an inch of moisture since this fall. So that's why these return to these precipitation events in the West Coast crop are very important. This is the area where we have the biggest concern, and it goes all the way up to the Northern Rockies. Now, the Northern Rockies portion of the equation, typically during the wintertime, particularly eastern Montana, western and North Dakota, during the wintertime, get caught between the transition of the fall where the jet stream is heading southward, and then they have to wait for the spring for the jet stream to come northward. So during that late December through essentially early March period, this area really doesn't get a lot of big snows. They return as the jet stream itself returns northward. As long as that occurs in this region, we'll see some semblance of improvement. This does not show, as you go toward the northwest, of course, the Rocky Mountains kind of swing toward the northwest. There is above normal snowpack all the way up into this region. Is it enough to undo the damage of last year? No. But if they have fall or spring pattern, sort of like they had this fall, we're going to see above normal flows coming out of the Missouri River stem of Montana into the reservoirs downstream. So what's the driving force? Well, here's your signal. This is a 90-day animation of the La Nina, the colder than normal signal you see in the equatorial Pacific. But watch how it's starting to shrink up. And notice the warmth starting to intrude, cutting off the flow of cold from Antarctica. And also notice that warm intrusion toward the Gulf of Alaska. The atmospheric river vents have been developing along the intersection of that cold pocket in the Gulf of Alaska and this warm pool that has been sitting over the west central and central Pacific, north central Pacific. So as those systems run about there, they have the advection to keep them going, or evaporation from the surface keeps them going, and then the difference between the temperatures between these two boundaries also helps to juice up these storm systems. The bigger thing that we're seeing is a weakening of this pattern in the Gulf of Alaska, and we're also seeing a weakening with the currents coming off of Antarctica up the west coast. That's their natural flow. So as this dissipates, we have to look below the surface to see if there's any support. Here's your 90-day animation. Look at that warm pocket. Last year this developed just like this, and then it fell apart. You got in summer, we had cold upwelling coming into the central part of the equatorial Pacific. I've never seen this in my career. There's always something to learn from this. Most of the time we see this cold upwelling right along the coast. This is South America. That's Indonesia, Australia on this side. You'll notice the last of that pocket of cold that's coming up the surface is about 30 days left. And that will be at the surface, and there's nothing but warmth below it on your return current, and look at the upwelling, warm water upwelling. It's not cold water. This event is over for the most part. It's just a matter of how persistently will it last. Now, the one thing I want to tell you about El Nino La Nina designation, it's not the entire basin that they're concerned about. It is a central equatorial region that is the basis for El Nino La Nina. So it's the last place that it's going to see that warmth override it. And that's why the expectations, or at least from forecast standpoint, is that this La Nina event will continue through the winter period and transition in the early spring. It's simply from a standpoint that this is colder than normal. But I will tell you, I hit the wrong button here. Now, yes, I didn't. It's supposed to be a static picture. What I will tell you is that last year, when we've seen an increase in that split flow pattern really develop, we've seen some unusual warming in the eastern equatorial Pacific north of the equator. That moisture gets ejected up into the southwestern United States. So if you've got a weak or a moderate southern stream, it can pull that energy eastward, that moisture eastward. The systems, once they get east of the southern Rockies, start to make their northeastern turn, and that's exactly what we see last winter. So if you look at the consensus of the global models, and this is always a climatologist's worst nightmare, and from a forecasting standpoint, this is also the worst nightmare. When everybody's in agreement, you start to panic. And if you look at these models, they all show the same pattern. They don't diverge from each other, they're all following the same pattern. And that is that we consistently will warm as we go through this year in the equatorial region. And the red line here, which is a dynamical model, it's not a statistical model, but the dynamic. So the ones that are looking at the whole atmosphere, trying to put it in perspective, whether you believe it or not, they're all showing the same thing. And it basically comes in at this, we get this August, September, October, comes in at about 50% of the way it needs to be toward El Nino formation. I didn't show a probability table, we're not going to bog you down with details, but from 1 month to the last update, it just came out middle of January compared to the December update. The probability levels of El Nino development increased 10%. Now that's a pretty big jump in my field. But we watch in the next 2 months to see whether or not that's going to increase rather dramatically, because that usually brings the moisture back to the southern plains at the expense of the northern plains. So the biggest issue will be timing. How quickly will this occur, and will it have an impact on cropping? But from the perspective of the southern plains, as the eastern equatorial Pacific begins to warm, we should see a return to some type of pattern that was close to what we seen last winter with that aggressive southern spring. Bigger issue is will it at the same time still have some semblance of upper air trough over the Great Lakes? Because if we're in warm, moist air and intersect with cold atmospheric content with that upper air trough over the Great Lakes, you have a similar dynamic that you're going to see with this storm that's going to curve down across Arkansas, southern Missouri, and those points with a massive ice storm. This is a type of pattern that is actually very well correlated to ice-type storms as we go through the spring. I'm not calling for an ice storm in Nebraska, but it would not shock me whatsoever that we will see a major ice storm not only to the south, but somewhere here in the central United States from Nebraska eastward to Ohio, just simply because we have so much Arctic air in place and we start moving warmer over top of it. And that result is in those type of conditions. So, this is one thing that CPC has been very consistent on, is keeping at below normal conditions. And I will bring this up to your attention because in order for this to verify, that means there's going to have to be a trough in the northwestern United States. So if that trough is going to return there, we're in that February, March, April period, those are the type of patterns, instead of moving up over top of a big wave and then coming down through the north central United States, and then driving a big trough over the eastern United States. Now we'll have the trough in the west, and we'll be looking with this type of temperature profile projected for some type of southeastern United States high to develop. That will help to assist moisture at the low levels coming out of the western Gulf of Mexico. More importantly, this is one I've been watching rather dramatically, or watching rather closely, not dramatically, watching very closely because the persistence of these forecasts has been to make this eastern U.S. trough deeper, staying the moisture across the central and eastern corn belt and work toward Nebraska, and intensifying the above normal moisture over the northern Rockies. So, we'll wait to see whether or not this does develop here over the southwest in the western Kansas. But if we're seeing a trough return to the Pacific Northwest, my suspicion is that at least from Colorado and Kansas northward, that CPC is way overplaying this. They're playing this more like the pattern that we are in right now, and not so much what we would expect of a trough over the western United States. But these are very, very hard to see here. And I want to draw your attention, they go by 3-month intervals. So your next interval up here is March, April, May. And then on the next one, you got April, May, June, June, July, May, June, July. Notice the interior of these 3-month period. This, the very one here on the second slide down, on the left side, is your June, July, August, then you go July, August, September, October. EC. As a meteorologist, whenever I see that type of pattern, I'm not logically think about a trough. This is a secondary reason why, and I'm going to agree with CPC on this, is that if this trough materializes in this, as it showed here, we aren't going to have a lot of issues across the corner about in terms of moisture. It may be excessive moisture. There certainly isn't going to be a drought type signal. That basically suggests an upper air trough when you have equal chances here with a bigger intensity to the west. And I think even CPC may overdo this to some point because it's a matter of how quickly does that snowpack in the west melt, and how aggressive of a snow do we get the remainder of the winter to help build that snowpack. So the bigger snowpack, the less likely that ridge will materialize as early as it has the last couple of years, which basically keeps the heat dome from expanding northward and pushing the northern jet well up into southern Canada. It keeps that jet stream along the Canadian border and helps assist with precipitation. So when we look at this from a precipitation standpoint, you can see that there's consistently a wet pattern in these regions, in the portions of the central corn belt, and a dry pattern in the southwest. But notice that dry pattern means that even CPC is swinging it up into swinging up into the northern Rockies, all the areas, for the most part, from the Central Plains to the Northern Plains, which is Kansas, Nebraska, and the Dakotas, you just don't see that ridge impinging into our region. So from my standpoint, first of all, I think CPC is way out the launch in terms of how aggressively they move that drive pattern up into that region, considering we have a snowpack. But more importantly, draw your attention right here. That is your October to December period. One thing to understand is that during La Nina years, the typical average is for us to see national corn harvest activity above normal, meaning it's going at a quicker pace than we normally would expect. When we see El Nino conditions developing, we typically start to see a weather condition during the fall period for the central and to some extent the southern plains, when we see an impedance in terms of harvest activity. So there's one thing, if this doesn't play out the way I expect, might be a little bit more problematic in the crops in this fall, but it also sets up for some better moisture as we go through the winter period, especially the southern half of the state. So I want to show you what I'm talking about in the movement of this jet stream, because this is very important, and I think I'm going to actually make this in time. This is kind of the troughing pattern we see over the Hudson Bay. You see the big upper low there. You see that trough digging down. Now, this has various shapes and forms. As once this pivots around with it, explodes up the eastern seaboard, it'll pull that trough northward. The next system will come down and intensify. What these last few storms are starting to show is a break away from that trough. So you can see that low in the southwest. And notice the ridge has been shoved a little bit farther toward the west. Instead of it being a solid ridge all the way through to the eastern or to the western, or should I say the continental divide of the ridge, you're starting to see that shifting. The other thing to notice is that you see that ridge building up, and you see the energy down, or very center on the left-hand side. Those are able to undercut that high pressure system coming to the southwest. Secondarily, that ridge just means lift. Notice down along the Baja Peninsula, see the moisture that's starting to show there. So it's already starting to tap some of that warmer water than normal that's starting to develop. And I suspect that will increase dramatically. So as it increases, this is that transition I was talking about. We start to see that trough transitioning to the west. This isn't going to happen overnight. Again, it will take several weeks. And once it does, we need to see some break in the southeast to help support that. But from this standpoint, even under these conditions, those little pieces of red energy there are going right across the southern southwestern desert through Texas and going up eastern seaboard if that trough shifts to the east. So from my standpoint, we have numerous opportunities to see Texas itself wet up over this next few weeks. And as it wets up, it's going to increase the dynamics of systems coming out, providing more surface moisture as the jet itself lifts up. So this is going to be the key issue. If it does develop, we're going to be in pretty good shape. We're going to have above normal snowpack in the central Rockies. It won't be a water issue. It'll be a matter of how much above normal will it be. And it certainly will be much more extensive across the western United States. However, if I'm wrong, I'm going to be wrong in the biggest way possible. So this is what I'm trying to tell you. As you progress forward for this season, try to plan defensively with the knowledge that if this doesn't materialize, likely to see some pretty widespread dry conditions across the western corn belt, particularly the area south of Interstate 80. That is the area that is most correlated to these type of conditions. However, if these come this spring, then the bigger issue is going to be spring planting in the eastern corn belt and aggressively wet conditions. And then waiting for the dryness issues to develop across the northern plains as we get into the late summer. So I know these are tough to read. This is what happens when you try to put everything in one slide. You're definitely in the death throes of this La Nina. It's just a matter of is it going to be the next month or the next 2 months before we completely move into what we call neutral conditions. At that time, we probably see a much more aggressive southern spring and less of an impact of the northern U.S. trough positioned over the Hudson Bay region. Again, I've already pointed out the differences between 20 and 21 fall period, and we're actually seeing the same conditions in the winter period so far. So logically, we take this forward, look at how you're around this region, look at how your temperatures and your precipitation patterns last year were moved to the spring and early summer. Flip them, that's probably more likely what you're going to see, because we were seeing the persistence of that type of pattern. Again, these atmospheric river events are very, very important for western West snowfall. Not only are they 50% of the snowfall, but when they're above normal number of events, we see much more widespread snowfall across the western United States. And that's a key issue for keeping that high pressure system in check, for not to get out of control and seeing these aggressively hot patterns develop like we did last year. We got the second half of the summer. Now, we already talked about the Sierra Snow Lab stuff. Again, just basically, it's above normal. There's room for them to go 30 days without any major concerns, as long as it doesn't extend out to 60 days. Then we start to get a little bit concerned that it may not come back. One thing about it, this is not going to be like last year where we get just 10 days of Arctic infiltration. What we've seen so far this winter is likely to continue. That is the movement between very warm conditions and occasional cold conditions. Nothing in the models, even with the trough in the western United States, look like Arctic air is going to lock into place over here. It's been locked into place basically over the Great Lakes, and that's probably the extent of it. More important, if that Arctic air does infiltrate on occasion, as we see the western U.S. trough build, and we get the warmth that we normally do in the spring, we are set up for classic severe weather outbreaks this spring, which we haven't really seen a lot of the last couple of springs. It's a pretty sad statement when you get the vast majority of your tornado touchdowns in the month of December. We had more tornado touchdowns this December than we had the entire season up to that point. We went from 8 to 30. Now, I will tell you something about tornado statistics, and if you're not too familiar with this. If a tornado touches down, NWS will do an analysis to try to figure out, was it a tornado, was it a straight line, what was the strength of that tornado? When a tornado lifts up in the air and the damage at the surface stops, that tornado came to an end, even if the funnel cloud is still there. When that tornado comes back down to the surface, we now have a new tornado. So in the case of the event that we had in December, the initial report was 8 tornadoes. After assessment was all done, we ended up with 30. And that's that skipping motion we had with the tornado. So in many cases, when we have large tornado outbreaks, it's generally the same cluster of storms that keep popping up and down with those tornadoes that increases our counts. Last and foremost, the two things. It does appear to me that we're going to go into some type of El Nino conditions or El Nino-like conditions as we go into late summer. That's supported more areas in the southern plains. But here's the primary one. There's nothing else that I can get through your heads. Be aware of all the drought chat. There are places in the country where that's appropriate. But your competitors in the more favorable moisture environments, the central and eastern corn belt, really are not looking at drought conditions. We're really looking at excessive moisture conditions. And if we get normal precipitation or some semblance of normal precipitation during the growing season without it being most majorly put in the first 30 days of the growth stage of that corn, I'm going to say right up in front, we're looking at national production. And that's based on climatology, based on the availability of nitrogen and holds of it. I can't forecast that. I don't know if anybody can forecast that. But from a standpoint of the way the climate's set up right now, there's ample moisture produced a big crop. From a crop insurance standpoint, this is the year that there's going to be a year where we're going to see a lot of northwest flow of law type pattern. Remember that trough I was showing that showed EC? If that is the position of a trough on the backside of that, is where these little systems come down the backside of that upper low, we call those northwest flow of law. Those are the ones where we tend to see a lot more severe weather in terms of thunderstorm lines. But it's the trough coming out of the Pacific Northwest In the spring period, it pulls down to the southern Rockies and shoots those systems at the surface up from southeast Colorado to the northeast. They're the ones that we most watch for on ag development. And right now, if we switch over, as I expect, we're going to be in a very favorable pattern for a lot of that to develop. So your key to watch for is, do we see massive type of thunderstorm development and severe weather across Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas as we move through the next month, 2 months? If that occurs, then we're likely to see that whole process evolve northward until the trough reestablishes itself after 6 or 8 weeks in the northern portions of the upper Great Lakes, and then we get into northwest fall. And if we get enough precipitation, then it's just going to aggregate the time of precipitation risk. And if you pay attention to funnel boundary passages, we're getting ample funnel boundary passages in this neck of the woods and in eastern Nebraska, that if we get into a higher moisture environment, they're going to produce precipitation. And as long as I've been here, if we get 2 funnel boundary passages plus a week, it ain't going to be dry. So with that, I think I'm going to do this, although I haven't put any of this up this month. I want to keep up to date on, I started to do this here during my little COVID prison sentence in the university. Put out a weekly forecast that's issued from April, or actually from March, through the end of the cropping season. And the end of the cropping season is defined by the time when soybean, sorghum, and corn harvest has exceeded 95%. This year, that was basically around Thanksgiving time, and all those criteria were met. So when I put that weekly forecast together, we can review. I'll give you some stats from a NAS standpoint, and Nebraska statistics. Then I go into a 2.5 week forecast. Gets you up 16 days. So if you watch my market journal, you can see how much I changed my tune in the next 4 days. I can do it on my own record. You go back and look at any of these over the last year and a half, see whether I'm blowing smoke up, you know what. You can always claim that I'm a great forecaster, but this is the reality. It's now in print. So no excuse, it's there. Now, any of the special things, like our seasonal forecasts, tornado outbreaks, La Nina, those are going to come out in the seasonal special weather events. Nothing has been issued for the month of January like normal. Unfortunately, I got informed on our testing protocol that I was COVID positive at the beginning of the month. So basically, I put prison for another 10 days. I wasn't able to get into my building, let alone worry about putting this in together. So I'll be putting that all together, both the ENSO and the monthly outlooks, this week if I get back to the office. Now, I haven't talked about Thursday night, but nothing would interfere with me doing this out. The ENSO forecast will be issued the 3rd Friday of every month, because they will follow the day after CPC looks at their seasonal forecast. And a week prior to that, they actually put out their ENSO forecast, but I want both of them to see how they change their dynamics, and then I'll put my spin on it. As far as spring, summer, fall, and winter forecasts, they will also come out the 3rd week of the month prior to the spring forecast, or the season is coming into play. So, to give you an idea, this month coming up, 3rd week of February, I'll be putting out our spring forecast. 3rd week of May, summer forecast, etc. All of them are up in this area. If you have any questions or you see things that I'm not including in there, feel free to drop us a line. We'll try to make an attempt to put some of that information in there if I can deem it valuable to anybody else. So I still have 5 minutes. Any questions? Or have I depressed you to the point where you're ready to start throwing your things at me? I see nobody choked on their food, so I think that is a good sign. Yes. I honestly believe that we will move into either late summer or early fall. Now, one thing, thank you for asking that, and I forgot to repeat the question for the folks that are on the Zoom. The question was going back into El Nino by this fall, late summer, this fall. My understanding from the models and from what I'm looking at the surface, I suspect that we definitely will. Key issue will be, does this timing move forward? The reason I say that is if it's not about the late fall or late summer, early fall, it'll likely be a weak event. Earlier it materializes, that warm crop comes up, and we start moving toward El Nino-like conditions. And El Nino-like conditions just means that we're in that area from 0 degrees Celsius, normal, and the entire basin will have 1 degree Celsius. Those are the warm side of what we call neutral. You get El Nino-like conditions. If those conditions develop earlier, our events tend to be stronger. If they're stronger, the statistics become stronger for those type of patterns. And one of the most persistent patterns with El Nino is a lot of very happy people in the wheat growing region of the central and southern plains. 70% of the time. 1/3 of them, they fail. And those are the years we have to be cognitively aware of, because when they fail, and you follow it up with normal conditions, you tend to see some of that starting to move up into central and northern plains.
On the you said wet harvest,
Okay.
wet harvest, right?
Yes. The question was that I said wet harvest, not northern plains. I-80 corridor into the south. The northern plains during El Nino events tends to continually return dry, and of course subsoil moisture recharge becomes critically important. And you end up entering the same type of conditions that you did this previous growing season with a fall, fell apart, followed by a spring falling apart. So it's just one part of the equation. You gotta have both of them work. But once you're dry, the only way you make it up, especially in the western fringes of the corn belt, you gotta have an aggressively wet spring. Otherwise, you carry an inherent drought risk going forward. And the more inches you're below normal, the higher your drought risk. For northeastern Nebraska, right away that they were facing a 20% yield reduction, just being 4 inches shy of normal recharge going through the end of April. For each inch shy, you get 2.5 to 5% yield reduction, depending on how you're growing season precipitation. There's it's normal, 2.5% is below normal. Those probabilities increase rather dramatically. You get up to that 5% per inch short with normal precipitation.
Other questions for Al? Al, I learned a new word a couple of years ago, derecho. Derecho, I don't know what you're going. It seems like since then I've seen more of those. Maybe that's just confirmation bias, but
no, it's not confirmation bias, and it has to do with statistics. It has to do with media. Look at all the big words that come on TV now. I mean, what do we have? The Polar Express, bond cyclogenesis, the ratios occur every year. It's just our location is different every year, and they depend on where the jet stream sets up. Jet ratios are just a fancy term for a linear line of thunderstorms that's self-sustaining once it gets going, and has average wind speeds of 70+ miles per hour. They're more common in Texas and Oklahoma than they are up in this region, but when they occur, when do they typically occur here? June, July, and August, but it really can cause a lot of damage. And since that's a lot of wheat country down to the south, or it's even we do have some of the corn, but wheat harvest is generally, for the most part, over. So the damage, you just don't get the damage results from them. Rest don't care about a couple million people that got blown away. It's not 15, 30 million of them in the Northeast that can't shove their driveways out without having a heart attack. That's the difference of what's going on here. You know, the interconnectivity of the internet has made everybody a weather genius, so to speak, or think they're a genius. And if you don't understand climatology and meteorology, that's why I spent a lot of money to go to school to do that. There's a big difference between me and a meteorologist on the team. They got a broadcast, and I'm going to be honest, I'm nothing against any of our meteorologists. I can tell you from a fact what's going to happen. because it was in the press this morning last time of year. Already writing about Lincoln's snowfall total. It's only on 3.7 inches. Geez, guys, what about last year? We had 40 inches in 6 weeks. And we have a seasonal total of 50 inches. In the previous 2018, 2019, we ended up with like the second or third most significant snow season on record. So over the last 3 years, we're averaging still, even with this poor year, we're still 10 inches above our average, not including what's coming. And that's the problem. I heard the same crap middle of December. Everybody's whining because there was no snow in Colorado. 3 weeks. All it took was 3 weeks. That's your warning for this year. Everything that is occurring is supersized. Well, if you take one snowfall event, then you're going to hear any of this stuff anymore. And if it follows up with a second snowfall event, then I'm going to get called, why do we get so much snow this year? It's cold winter. And that's the problem with it. We're not human emotions. It's not doing any of us any justice. And I just wish there was some sanity here in regards to what is normal and what's not. Now, I heard of plaintiff's atmospheric river events, and thank you, Noah, one of the first times they come out and said, this is normal. This is what an atmospheric river event does to the western U.S. snowfall, and it's got to happen where you have a drought. You haven't heard anything about atmospheric river events since in the press. So that kind of gives you an idea. It's just one disaster after another, and I hate to say this, sucks fellas, so does disaster when it comes to the crop. The good thing is, who cares? All right. Thank you very much for allowing me to be here. I'm a little long-winded here by about 2 minutes. I hope all of you have the best success, because the way that to control the weather, put a normal high pressure over Iowa and Illinois, such that we always were on a return flow. Of course, I wouldn't be here talking to you, but if I had that kind of control, I would definitely then feel like a god. So good luck, everybody. I hope I'm right on this, but still, consider that defensive play until these conditions develop. And at that point, you probably have to reassess and keep in mind that if you get the second half of summer, particularly north of Interstate 80, if El Nino event itself starts to develop, that we should start to see a drying pattern materialize across the Dakotas, and that's likely to spread southward until we get into the harvest period. Otherwise, best of luck to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alan. Interesting and entertaining as always.